I think that they'll probably be vindicated, and I think probably there will be a ceasefire sooner rather than later, and that probably many of them will return to the front bench. I imagine that Jess Phillips will, and others. I mean, Keir Starmer will want them.
Let's speak to Mark Seddon now, former Tribune editor. That is the socialist political magazine. Just to get his take, we'll find out what he's hearing this evening. Good evening to you, Mark.
Well, good evening. I have to say that was a long time ago. I mean, I spent a long time working for the United Nations, for the Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, and also for presidents of the General Assembly. And I would simply say that when it comes to Keir Starmer and what's just happened now, it's kind of almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy, because really all the Labour leader and his shadow foreign secretary and shadow cabinet had to do was to follow what the United Nations was saying and what the vast majority of member states at the United Nations have had to say as well about a ceasefire. And I think you can trace this back, unfortunately for him, to that interview he gave to LBC when he was asked about water, electricity and energy and whether it would be all right for the Israelis to cut it off. And that was the signal, I think, to many on his back benches and on his front bench that this international human rights lawyer had not thought it through. And he has had plenty of time since to rethink it. His failure has led to this.
Many people argue he has fought it through. He next year may well be our main representative, our prime minister, and so far he's fallen in line with other Western governments, Joe Biden, etc.
It's not. President Macron is saying something very different. Many other European countries are, and of course, 2/3 of member states, the General Assembly, have voted for a ceasefire. So, I think the mistake he's making is he's hanging too much on what the United States is doing. And it could be rather embarrassing if Secretary of State Blinken decides in the next week or so to change the policy. And as to your point about he may be prime minister, well, he may be. But this terrible war will hopefully be over by then. But the question, of course, for so many on his back benches is now. There are hundreds of thousands of people in North Gaza and Gaza City who are without food or water. And a ceasefire is desperately what is needed. That's what they voted for.
Okay. Yeah. Now, look, there are differences of opinion. We know that about the ceasefire. Keir Starmer has made his bed. Whatever the arguments and the good arguments for a ceasefire, the Labour leaders determined to stick to humanitarian pauses. That was defeated anyway in the Commons today. What do you make of those shadow ministers, those front benchers, Mark, who have fallen on their sword over this? Jess Phillips and the others as well, the 7 others that we're hearing who voted yes for a ceasefire and said, you know what my constituents want and what I think is more important than falling in line with Keir Starmer. What does that say about Keir Starmer's authority?
I think that they'll probably be vindicated, and I think probably there will be a ceasefire sooner rather than later, and that probably many of them will return to the front bench. I imagine that Jess Phillips will, and others. I mean, Keir Starmer will want them. So I think they've made their decision on the basis of their consciences. That's the whole point of them really being in Parliament. I mean, of course, they're there to have power, but what's the point of power unless you do the right thing? And they've done the right things by not only their constituents, but probably by the bulk of British public opinion. The last poll we had was back in October 19. 76% of people favoured a ceasefire. And I'm sure it's probably more than that now. So they're on the right side of history. I think they can be very comfortable. I think Sir Keir Starmer and David Lammy and others, they need to go away and rethink. And they need to think about how we're being seen by the rest of the world. That's very important for a Labour. There's going to be.
For now, how we're seen by the rest of the world, that's not up to Keir Starmer. What is up to Keir Starmer is to keep his party in line. If he's to have any chance of maintaining his poll lead, it could all crumble beneath him. And this is important because the Labour Party has worked long and hard for this moment. What does he need to do, Mark?
Well, you see, I think he has to listen to the voters and to the natural supporters of the Labour Party. very many of them will have been on those peace marches. That's a very substantial body of opinion that votes Labour will be saying we want to have a ceasefire. But traditionally the Labour Party's been very sympathetic towards the Palestinians, also sympathetic to Israel too. Really, as the peace party, he's made a bit of a mistake there. I think he can rectify it. But if there's a slippage of, it's not just about how you look and your discipline and whether you can hold things together, but it's taking the right judgment. And if he'd exercised the right judgment about this issue from the get-go, then he wouldn't have got himself into this fix. So I think he knows what he has to do. He is, after all, an international humanitarian lawyer, for goodness sake.
Okay. Are you concerned for the party, Mark?
I'm actually more content in a funny way, because I think that the Labour Party has been kind of steamrolled into this straitjacket, and people are being too frightened to express opinions about things that are very, very important. And actually, the Labour Party has found its voice again. And I think that, in any political organisation, there has to be democracy and accountability. And also, for a party that was part and parcel of the setting up of the UN after the war, you would have thought that we'd be paying much closer attention to what the UN is saying and doing, and hopefully that's what's going to happen, and voters will like that.
Okay, well, look, thank you so much for speaking to us today. It is an